This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Film Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. That's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, casting stories, all the bits and bobs really that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning than anything else, really. They're films I'm interested or invested in to some degree. I'm not interested in punching down. I'm not really interested in snarl. If anything, the podcast is a celebration of the fact that it's really hard to make a film, and here's a whole bunch of people who managed to do just that. Enough waffle. I've got loads to get through with the two stories I'm going to tell you in this episode. And without further ado, I'm going to play you a clip from the first of them. Let's go back to 1990. Pick up the story the other side of this.
Call recall. For the memory of your ideal vacation.
You were interested in a memory of,
Mars.
You're gonna love this, Doug.
Yeah, but how real does it seem?
As real as any memory in your head. You are on your most important mission.
Do you want to know the future?
What about the past?
You are not you. You're me.
They erased your identity and implanted a new one.
That, of course, was part of the promotion for 1990's Total Recall, directed by Paul Verhoeven. Screenplay to this one credited to Ronald Shusett, Dan O'Bannon and Gary Goldman. Screen story, Shusett, O'Bannon and John Poville. Based on the short story by Philip K. Dick. The cast led by Arnold Schwarzenegger, Rachel Ticotin, Sharon Stone, Ronnie Cox and Michael Ironside. So, I mean, the origins of this one clearly go back to the short story, and that was penned by Philip K. Dick, and it went by the title We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. It was first published in 1966, and it is a short story. Going to come to the importance of that shortly. And one of the many people, well, a couple of the many people who've read it are Ron Shusett and Dan O'Bannon. And if we fast forward to 1979 here, they were hot off the back of the success of the first Alien film. As a consequence, they did a deal with Disney, of all places, to develop the Philip K. Dick short story into a screenplay. What had happened just before this is Ron Shusett had picked up the rights off Philip K. Dick while he was still alive for around $1,000, and he brought his friend Dan O'Bannon on board. Now, they were up against the fact that the story was short. In fact, they describe it in David Hughes' excellent book Tales from Development Hell as basically the first part of the story, and they had to flesh it out. They had to turn this into something feature length, and so they decided to take the central character in the short story, Doug Quaid, to Mars, and they extended it open that way. So they wrote the screenplay, the first of many drafts of this script that were written. But by 1982, things weren't really working out. That Disney wasn't happy with the script that they'd written, specifically that last third of it, that it extended the story outwards, and as a consequence, it decided to put the project into turnaround, and it sold on what was now Total Recall to producer Dino De Laurentiis. Now, Dino De Laurentiis had a hit with umpteen movies over the years. 1980 was Flash Gordon, for instance, a legendary larger-than-life figure in the movie industry, and he picked it up in 1982, and over the next 5 or 6 years, another 40 or so drafts of the script were written, and in that time, lots of directors came and went, but came very close to making the film. Perhaps the most notable of those directors who nearly got this one over the line was David Cronenberg, and he talks about this in the book Cronenberg on Cronenberg, edited by Chris Rodley, and he says how Dino De Laurentiis was approaching him about lots of potential projects around this time, and one of them was Total Recall. And as Cronenberg laments in that book, I should have seen it coming. I wanted it to work out so badly that I pretended it could. It came very close, and it really did. Now, Cronenberg wasn't interested in making a big, loud, crashing action movie, but he was taken with the duality of it. He was taken with basically the premise of it. And he says in the book, the script by this stage was an infamous unmade movie. And he said it's about memory and identity and madness. However, not everyone agreed with him. And Cronenberg notably would not get on with Ronald Shusett, who stuck with the project throughout. And Cronenberg said, as far as Shusett was concerned, it was really Raiders of the Lost Ark go to Mars. Apart from the first third of the script, it was all action and shoot 'em up. Cronenberg would argue that Shusett wanted a big hit, and as it turned out, Shusett and Dan O'Bannon, who of course had co-written the script right at the start, you might call, they would fall out over basically the ending of the movie. Now, Cronenberg met another director, Craig Shepsey, who by that stage he'd also come and gone. He'd been involved. He'd written a couple of versions of the script. Richard Rush was another director by this stage. He'd come and gone as well. But Cronenberg would crack on and would do a dozen drafts of Total Recall himself. Now, somewhere along the line, Dino De Laurentiis, who was cautious about not wanting something like a $40 million Dune project, an infamous movie that basically leaked a lot of money, he didn't want another $40 million Dune on his hands. He wanted something basically in between what Ron Shusett was pushing for and what David Cronenberg was pushing for. I should note, in the midst of all of this, one piece of casting, and I'll come to casting, we're going to centre on this just for a second. Jeff Bridges at this point was said to be in the mix. Cronenberg was continuing to resist this being a high-tech film. But then he went over. I mean, he was really committed. He thought this was going to happen. So he went over to Dino De Laurentiis' studios in Rome several times. And then around this time, it looked as though Richard Dreyfuss was going to take the lead in the movie. William Hurt was another candidate put forward by Cronenberg. But it got to the point where Cronenberg started looking for locations. And over the course of a year, he worked on the many screenplays. And ultimately, he sent the 12th of those screenplays to De Laurentiis. He had a conversation with the producer, and as he said, Dino said we should go back to script number 9, and Cronenberg by this point was just fed up with the process, and he'd evolved the story. He didn't want to go backwards on it, and so it was number 12 or nothing. Dino De Laurentiis didn't want to make script number 12, and David Cronenberg walked away from the project. He also said he just couldn't deal with Ron Shusett anymore, and so, but ultimately De Laurentiis would a year or two later ring him back and say, yeah, you can do draft 12, but by this point Cronenberg was on his way to making The Fly. Cronenberg also notes in that book, Cronenberg on Cronenberg, that other films he was offered around this time were Witness, which went on to be made with Harrison Ford, and Top Gun, which, well, you know. Shusett put his side of the story in David Hughes' aforementioned book Tales from Development Hell, and he said that he argued Cronenberg quit for a number of reasons, and as the book says, Shusett explained that he felt the problems began around the time Richard Dreyfuss became interested in the role of Quaid. The actor was already an Oscar winner and star of 2 Steven Spielberg blockbusters, Jaws and Close Encounter of the Third Kind, and wanted the writers to mould the character of Quaid to his everyman persona rather than the action hero described in the O'Bannon-Shusett version. Total Recall was getting a reputation for a high-profile unmade film, and it wasn't for the lack of interest from studios either. It's worth noting. I mean, it's talked about in Premiere's June 1990 issue that companies such as Asco Embassy, MGM and Universal had at various times shown real interest in distributing the movie. It's just there was no agreement on this script. Then, let's go to 1988, and finally it looked like this was going to happen. Bruce Beresford, director of Driving Miss Daisy, was set to shoot the movie in Australia, and at this point Patrick Swayze was in line to take on the role of Quaid. But as it happened, Dino De Laurentiis' company, DEG, was in real trouble at that point, and it went under, and as a consequence it couldn't fund Total Recall at a point where it was again on the verge of being made. Now, one person who'd been following this particular saga was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Schwarzenegger had a relationship with De Laurentiis. They'd done Raw Deal together. And he'd been pushing De Laurentiis to cast him in the role of Quaid. He was really interested in the Total Recall project. And when he heard that De Laurentiis' company had gone under, well, Schwarzenegger just swung into action. He alerted a friend of his, Andrew Wagner, and Wagner happened to be the founding partner of Carolco. Now, Carolco's an infamous independent that was funding lots of high-profile movies over the course of its lifespan. In fact, the whole story of Carolco deserves a book of its own, I would suggest. And Carolco, importantly, they'd worked with Schwarzenegger before on the film Red Heat, and it had the funds, by canny use of selling foreign rights to movies and things like that, to acquire Total Recall on behalf of Schwarzenegger, and it stumped up $3 million for the project that had been put into basically turnaround by De Laurentiis' business falling. Now, Arnold Schwarzenegger would admit in his own memoir, cunningly entitled Total Recall, that he was unhappy Dino De Laurentiis didn't offer him the role of Quaid. But at the point where Carolco snapped it up, he was finally on board. And boy, did Schwarzenegger get a hell of a deal. Approval of the script, approval of the director, approval of the co-stars, approval of the marketing, a $10 million salary, his highest payday to that point, and a split of the profits. And it's worth noting that at this point, Arnold Schwarzenegger, while his career was very much on the up, Twins hadn't been released at that point. Predator had, and so he was an upcoming movie star, but he wasn't quite at the superstar level. It's often said that Total Recall pushed him there, but it was the canny release of Twins, I'd suggest, that also gave him a real push towards that. Thus, he'd struck this incredible deal to make to star in and oversee various aspects of Total Recall, but there was the matter of who's going to direct it. Well, the year before, Carolco had picked up the rights to the film. Schwarzenegger had met director Paul Verhoeven. They were introduced by a mutual friend, the editor of RoboCop, Frank Uriosti. And Verhoeven in 1987 had made RoboCop his first English language film. He got lots of admirers in Hollywood anyway for his Dutch back catalogue. But Verhoeven and Schwarzenegger had a conversation. They'd like to work together off the back of RoboCop. And with Carolco on board, Arnold Schwarzenegger brought Paul Verhoeven the script to Total Recall. Well, the pile of scripts to Total Recall, in truth. Now, Verhoeven was interested. He really was drawn to kind of the Hitchcock-style plot contortions, the duality of it, the push as to the identity of Quaid, and the idea of what's real and what isn't. So he made a bunch of story suggestions that continued to evolve the script. And by the autumn of 1988, rewrites were now in full flow. Another writer was brought on board, Gary Goldman, and the idea was he was going to be brought in to, quote the Premiere article, sharpen the story's denouement. Now, Verhoeven, by this stage, had been through 30 drafts of the script. He hadn't even got through all of them. He sent the ones to Goldman that he liked, and the project was basically moving forward with Goldman having to pull out the best of the best of what Verhoeven had sent over to him, and again come back to how do you fix the back end of the movie. This, though, with Carolco's investment and Carolco selling the international rights to the movie, well, the film was going to press ahead and it could move on to casting. And so, I mean, one notable casting story of this, and I go back to the Premiere article again for this one, is that Sharon Stone was brought in to play Quaid's wife in the movie. And Sharon Stone, again, I think she'd just done Police Academy 4 at the point she was auditioning for the role of Laurie. And they wanted to cast someone who was going to be a contrast to Schwarzenegger's character in the movie, that they had basically an everyday construction worker going through a boring day-to-day lifestyle, and he wanted him to have a more glamorous life to lend plausibility to the idea that there was a lot more to this character than you first realised. Schwarzenegger, though, he had approval over the casting, and it was a tough audition process for Sharon Stone. Schwarzenegger told Verhoeven that he needed a test scene where he and whoever was going to play his wife in the film got physical, not necessarily in the rude sense, but just tested the physical acting side of the role, because obviously there's some quite intense fighting stuff that goes on. And what happened was Verhoeven, Schwarzenegger and Stone booked a hotel room for 2 hours, which didn't look dodgy at hospital, and they went into that hotel room and rehearsed the pair having a fight on the hotel bed. It was enough to land Stone the role, and I'm very conscious telling these stories that Sharon Stone's voice, well, it's not in them, and part of the reason for that is she's not really spoken out an awful lot about the film. But at the point this podcast is being recorded at the end of 2020, her own memoir is due out in 2021 that might put another complexion on some of the tales that I'm telling. I'm always conscious with these podcasts that what I'm trying to do is not provide the definitive take of how a film was made, but certainly put the blocks in place for, if you want to find more, there are loads of places where you can go and do so. The rest of the casting then came together. Michael Ironside, of course, came in, Ronnie Cox, Rachel Tickerton rounding out the ensemble. And with the script finally in a place where everyone was as happy as they were going to get, filming could begin on Total Recall on the 20th of March 1989. Now, the production was sited at Churubusco Studios in Mexico City, and this would be a very long and arduous physical shoot. That the film went in the end to Mexico City in part for the architecture of the area. They were looking for a kind of bleak futuristic styling for the movie. Over 500 people decamped to the studios, and they built 45 sets that tied up 8 sound stages there for 6 months. There was Verhoeven at one point had been interested in shooting the film in Houston, but the finances of that really made it impractical. It was going to be much cheaper to film it in Mexico than it would be to shoot it in America. But even then, the budget at this point was still around 40 million, with Arnie 10 million on top, and the price was going to go up and up. Even as it started shooting, it was looking like Total Recall was going to be the second most expensive film in history at that point, after Rambo 3, which was funded by a company called, what do you know, Carolco. Even Arnold Schwarzenegger said this was a tough film to make. There were lots of night shoots. There were lots of injuries. Schwarzenegger and Sharon Stone didn't massively get on either. And it was an intense grind at a point where physical effects were having to do the bulk of the heavy lifting. Thankfully, the film had the genius of Rob Bottin, known for his work on his creature work on The Thing, of course, for coming up with some of the really ingenious in-camera practical effects that you see. But to get some kind of idea of just what it was like shooting the movie, I thought I'd bring in another voice. So I got on the phone to Michael Ironside and asked him about that, and here's what he had to say.
When we did Total Recall, that was the idea of doing a green screen behind somebody. In those days, it was a green screen, not a blue screen. Was an absolute new thing, and it was such a delicate thing. Yossel Canos, the DOP, I remember spending forever. It had to be the lighting on the green screens behind you or outside the windows had to be absolutely perfect, or it would show up in the transfers and the projections and stuff later, the computer art and stuff. And the set, we shot that in Churubusco. It's the oldest studios in North America, in Mexico City, and we took over the whole studio. When you saw our chase scenes from one city to the next through the tunnels, they were actually working. Those tunnels worked from studio to studio. You could start from one crowd, have a chase sequence if Paul wanted to do it all in one shot, and would come out at the other city and stuff. So we had 2 sets of extras and 2 different sets where we were doing those chase scenes and those modern futuristic cars of 30 years ago.
And in fact, Verhoeven talks about shooting that chase sequence on the director's commentary, the legendary director's commentary of the Total Recall disc, where he's joined by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that the chase sequence that Ironside's talking about there was done in a 30-yard long stretch of tunnel, and they did have to, it's a far longer sequence than you'd think for 30 yards, and so lots of camera trickery really was required to get over just the fact that the chase in the film was far longer than the chase that they were seeing on screen. I mean, it was almost a bit Fast and Furious 6 in terms of, you remember the runway in Fast and Furious 6? Must come to that in a future episode. All the while the price of the film was creeping up, it's worth noting that the practical effects and the precise style of Paul Verhoeven on the movie was leading to lots of takes. Verhoeven was also pushing back a little bit on Schwarzenegger style payoff lines in the film, because he needed the character of Doug Quaid grade to feel real. It couldn't be Schwarzenegger in full-on movie star mode, although a couple of payoff lines were allowed into the final cut of the movie. I mentioned Rob Bottin before as well, and apparently some of these, at least one of his practical effects, was impounded by immigration officials in Mexico, and it took what are described as, quote, gratuities for that to ultimately be released and made available to the production. Carolco, of course, had an awful lot invested in this one as well, and it got to the point where Schwarzenegger was protective of Verhoeven and, quote, he has mediated disputes with the producers. That's going back to that Premiere article. Schwarzenegger was also conscious that he'd won over a new fan base with Twins, which by this point had been released. I've covered it in a previous podcast, but that was a really huge success, and also a real gamble on Schwarzenegger's part that he had a good slice of the profits on. And so he was conscious he wanted to appeal to a slightly broader audience, and Verhoeven was shooting a very violent film. And so Schwarzenegger and Ron Shusett were asking Verhoeven to shoot less explicit violent scenes, just as a backup in case there was problems a little bit further down the line. To give you an idea of how much gore was sloshing around, at one point members of the crew had to put bin bags over their clothes to protect them. Such was the sheer amount that was being bandied around. I also, while I had Michael Ironside on the phone, incidentally, I did ask him about working with Verhoeven on the movie. He did have a few words on that, and I figure I'll hand you back over to him to say them.
Paul's a deft storyteller. He's a deft filmmaker. He's very much in control of his medium. I've done over 300 projects, work with over 280 different directors, 290 different directors. And Paul I put in the top 5 because most films you get into, it's a collaboration. It's almost done by a familial choice. You have the actors, you have the DOP, you have the writers, the director. And a smart director, if he's in trouble or she's in trouble, will say, well, what do you think here? We'll discuss it. Or, and everyone will get though they're the leader of the family, somebody in that group gets to say something on what's going on. Paul, the other way around. Paul's absolutely in charge. He's the artist in charge of his story. You know what I mean? And I only worked with Paul and Yost Ficano. Paul he alternates DOPs. I think he burns them out very quickly. So you'll do a film with Yost, and then he'll work with the other fellow. I've only worked with Yost, and then he'll go back to Yost, and he alternates. Yost used to say, "Yeah, I'm so exhausted, I go back to teaching after one of Paul's films." And I God, I don't know how to say this without sounding authoritarian. Look at. Filmmaking is not easy, even when you have all the right elements and everything like that. It's incredibly hard. It's incredibly difficult. No matter how much money, you have to know what you're doing. You have to be in charge of your storytelling. It's like going into the woods without a map. Sometimes you change something, you're lost. You go in circles and circles. Paul's never one of those. He knows exactly where he is, what he's doing, and how, and that feels safe as an actor. You know what I mean? It's almost like a paternal tribal chieftain leader. When we did Total Recall, we would do one side of a scene. Let's say the Cohagen office scene where I finally say, when I cock the gun and say, I'm going to go get him. And stuff like finally he lets me off the leash sort of thing. That we shot my side of that sequence, let's say on a Wednesday or something like that, Wednesday, Tuesday on 1 week. We didn't turn around and do his side of the sequence for almost 3 weeks to a month because the sets were so large and because of the green screens. You would shoot all one side, then you'd have to turn around and get the green screens or vice versa. It wasn't an easy shoot to do, as far as for technology. That was 6 months in Mexico City.
And those 6 months came to an end on the 23rd of August 1989, and thus it was into post-production. Now, the film was a tricky enough edit at the best of times. In fact, Schwarzenegger talks about, going back to that Premiere article, I love this, talks about Verhoeven in the edit suite and doing the looping, and Schwarzenegger says of him, it's like the first month on the shoot, he's screaming all over the place, running, making calls and giving everyone stuff. The problem that this one had in the build-up to its release, though, is no one really had heard of it. That this was a massive gamble. Again, one of those that's easy to overlook just what a big gamble it was. Yet with weeks until the release, the awareness of the movie just wasn't there. And it kind of fell between the fact that Carolco was an independent and it was relying on a big studio, TriStar, part of Sony, to distribute the movie. And thus, certainly in the US. Now, TriStar had put a trailer together that, let's just charitably say, wasn't doing a great job of selling the film, and so market research scores were done, and this comes from Schwarzenegger's memoir, and that said the audience awareness score out of 100 was in the 40s, and to be a big blockbuster movie you needed to be in the 90s. This was in trouble. This was a summer where there's already things like Dick Tracy, Days of Thunder, Die Hard 2, Back to the Future 3. There was tough competition out there. And so Schwarzenegger made a phone call again. He was friends with Peter Guber, who had just taken over as the boss at Sony Pictures. And Arnie got on the phone to him and said, unless you do something, this film is going to tank in America. And so Schwarzenegger asked Guber to take a look at the movie and take a look at the trailer. And he did so with John Peters, who was the co-chair of Sony at the time and his long-term production partner. And the pair of them sat through the film, and Guber said the film looks $100 million, the trailer $20 million. And they promised that the studio would recut it. Well, Schwarzenegger didn't want that, and of course he got this built into his contract, and he insisted on outside help. He insisted on going outside the studio's marketing department, and so in came a company called Simmer and Bacon O'Brien at the very last minute, and within a week there was a new trailer, and in came the tagline, they stole his mind, now he wants it back. The trailer was a much, much bigger hit, and all of a sudden the awareness of the movie with just a week or two until its release shot up to 92%. The marketing campaign in the end would not be cheap. It would cost around 30 million just to push the film in the first place. And what was happening against the backdrop of this is Verhoeven was going backwards and forwards, predictably so, with the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, over the rating for the movie. This was going to be given an X rating, which was still in existence at that point. And so an assortment of cuts had to be made throughout the film before the MPAA would allow it to go out with a far more consumer-friendly R rating on the film. But the work was complete. The film was released and it was a hit. Whilst David Cronenberg, for one, wouldn't be a fan of the final movie, Dan O'Bannon was not bowled over by either. Most critics were really quite taken by it. The science fiction film with quite a lot going on here, and also there was some pushback over its last act and whether that takes you out of the film. Verhoeven, though, from his point of view, and this is as spoiler heavy as I'll go on Total Recall, he suggested that the suggestion was there's a scene earlier in the movie where someone just lays out exactly what's going to happen if you take that particular take on the movie. So the duality point that was at the heart of Verhoeven saw was very much present in his final cut. There was some pushback against it, although there was huge praise for the visual effects work. In fact, it would go on to win Total Recall an Oscar for those effects. But for the purposes of the investors and the people behind it, well, it was box office that counted. And whilst the price of the film had shot up, believed to be in around $60-70 million, an enormous amount of money, topped only in the end by Die Hard 2 that summer, which would temporarily be the most expensive film ever made until Terminator 2 came over, another Carolco-Schwarzenegger collaboration, the following summer. Total Recall opened at number one with $25.5 million and at the start of June 1990, a huge amount by the standards of that time. It knocked Back to the Future Part 3 off the top of the box office. Also in the top 10, just by way of context, there's Bird on a Wire, Mel Gibson and Goldie Hawn, Pretty Woman, Cadillac Man. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles have been hanging around the chart for nearly 3 months, has had the Hunt for Red October, and spare a thought for the underappreciated Joe versus the Volcano, was still just clinging on in the top 10 after 13 weeks in the chart. Total Recall, importantly, would be an international sensation as well. It would take 119 million in the US, but another 141 million overseas. And this was the film that really cemented the international appeal of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it will all be doubled down on for Terminator 2 the year after. But when the video release came, and it was a video sensation as well, Total Recall would be marked as a huge hit. There was talk of a sequel as well. It's also worth noting that Schwarzenegger charged to be on the DVD commentary track. I've got a story on that on the Film Stories website. But there was talk of a sequel to the film. But I'm just going to pause. I'm just going to move on in a minute to the second of the two movies I'm going to talk about, because that's going to pick that story up. Before I do so, as I'm at the halfway point, just a couple of bits and bobs. I am an independent podcast producer. It makes me sound really grandiose, that. It doesn't make me sound like a nerd in a room with a microphone at all, but that's actually the truth of it. The only reason I've got this far, because I don't have a marketing budget, that much is clear if you've ever seen my promotions, is by your word of mouth and by your support. If you do like this podcast, then please, if you can subscribe to it, that helps me enormously and helps play the algorithms a little bit. If you can leave ideally a hugely positive review and just help me spread the word. Likewise with my print magazines, Film Stories and Film Stories Junior, of which you can find more at filmstories.co.uk. Any word of mouth you can give me is just gold dust. However, I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this particular episode. What do you know? It's really rather linked to the first. Let me play you a clip.
Why are you trying to kill me?
Your memory was erased. Your mind was implanted with a life you think you've lived. Oh, by the way, you haven't even begun to see me trying to kill you. Get in. I've been looking for you everywhere.
That then was a clip from, what do you know it, Total Recall, the 2012 version, directed by Len Wiseman. The script for this one credited to Kurt Wimmer and Mark Bombach. To be absolutely complete on the writing credits, they also referenced that it's based on the motion picture Total Recall, screenplay by Arnold Schwarzenegger, Dan O'Bannon, Gary Goldman, based on the screen story by Schwarzenegger, Dan O'Bannon and John Povell. We've kind of covered that. This one starred Colin Farrell as Quaid, Kate Beckinsale, Jessica Biel, Bryan Cranston, Bokeem Woodbine, Bill Nighy and John Cho in the extensive ensemble for this really quite ambitious remake. Now, picking up from where I left off just before I started callously trying to sell you things, there had been talk in the aftermath of the success of the first Total Recall film of a direct sequel to that one. And so in 1994, for instance, director Ronnie Yu was linked with making the film, so that would be 4 years on from the release of the original. Then by 1998, Jonathan Frakes was of Star Trek, of course, and he was building an impressive directing career fueled by Star Trek First Contact. I will come to that at some point in the podcast. And so in 1998, he was lined up to do it. And this was based on another Philip K. Dick short story that would ultimately become the Steven Spielberg film Minority Report in 2002. What wasn't helping the plan for another film was the financial frailty of Carolco, which by this point was in serious trouble. It was gambling everything on a film called Cutthroat Island, which that film didn't go to plan commercially. And as a consequence, Carolco ultimately went bankrupt and its assets went up for auction. And this is where the Weinsteins got their paws on it, when Dimension, which is headed up by Bob Weinstein, not Harvey Weinstein, but still, picked up the sequel, remake and prequel rights to the 1990 film. It got into an auction with a rival company Live, and an auction that started at about $150,000, topped out at $3.15 million, and that's what it cost Dimension just to get the rights to make a new Total Recall film. Now, Arnold Schwarzenegger at this point was said to be interested, although he's fairly open about being interested in sequels to most of his films, I would suggest. But Bob Weinstein at that point already had ruled out Paul Verhoeven as a director. He told Variety, "We're going to our Miramax stable of directors. We've discussed story ideas, we have a concept, and we're going forward with this within the next year." Spoiler, they didn't. And that, I mean, the Weinsteins ultimately exited Miramax, and the Weinstein story has taken on, a completely different complexion more recently, with Harvey Weinstein now convicted rapist. In the midst of all of this, Total Recall 2 just quietly died a death, not least because Schwarzenegger then went off and pursued his political ambitions, and as a result, he just wasn't making movies for basically an 8-year stretch. Hollywood, though, while Schwarzenegger was off governing California, was getting the remake bug. And it was at the point in the 2000s where it was mining anything it possibly could for a remake or a reboot, just to mitigate the risk of making a big movie. Could they link it to an existing property? And so there was talk in the 2000s of a new RoboCop film, which ultimately came to fruition. I've discussed that in a previous podcast. And in June of 2009, news finally broke that a Total Recall remake project of sorts was moving forward. It was moving forward, and many have pointed out the irony of this name, at a company called Original Film, headed up by a man called Neil Moritz, who was also involved in a bunch of other potential remakes. I mean, there was talk of another Starship Troopers big screen outing around this point. And so it was a case of, let's hire a screenwriter and get on with it. That there was a feeling that the 1990 film, for all its qualities, had not been expressly loyal to the Philip K. Dick short story, so that seemed like a reasonable place to start again. Kurt Wimmer then was the first screenwriter hired, and this was primarily, he was working with Sony already on the film Salt. Again, I've talked about that a few weeks ago on the podcast, but he'd sprung to prominence off Equilibrium as well, and he was the first screenwriter hired to take a new crack at a new take on Total Recall. This was announced in Variety, and at this point, Variety also confirmed that the film was set up at Columbia Pictures, that it had got the remake rights from Miramax, and Miramax by this point was owned by Disney, so Disney's been basically at the start of both of these films, oddly enough. Miramax retained an option to co-finance the movie, but opted not to take that option up. In after a while came co-screenwriter Mark Bombach. He took a pass at the script. Word came out this was happening. The online backlash quickly began. It's not the first, it's not the last film to be met by internet comments suggesting it's sacrilege that you're remaking a particular film, but let's just say there was a vocal fan base who were not keen on Total Recall getting a remake. Nonetheless, the project had some momentum behind it. So, in the summer of 2009, it had come to public prominence. By summer of 2010, it had a director. In fact, in July 2010, Len Wiseman was in talks to direct the movie. Now, Wiseman at that point was best known for directing Underworld, and he'd also done the fourth Die Hard movie, Live Free or Die Hard 4.0, depending where you live. And Wiseman was also a huge fan of the Philip K. Dick short story. He said in the Hollywood trades at that point, I've always been fascinated with Philip K. Dick's short story, so he told you. And I'm excited at the prospect of diving even deeper into the type of world it evokes and the questions it asks. I love that the most crucial mystery our character is trying to solve is one of his own soul. Now, Len Wiseman would tell Total Film magazine in an interview around the time of the film's ultimate release that at first every wrestling star seemed to be linked with the role of Doug Quaid in the new movie, that it was assumed that it would be someone of the ilk of Arnold Schwarzenegger, certainly the physique of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who would take the part on. But that wasn't what Len Wiseman wanted, and it's not what he saw in the character of Doug Quaid. He saw something he wanted someone more vulnerable to play Quaid. In fact, it probably goes back a little close to what Cronenberg was looking for in the original Total Recall movie, and so he started pursuing Colin Farrell. Now, Wiseman signed on the dotted line to direct the film. He committed to it, and by October 2010, the shortlist surfaced for who was going to take on the part of Quaid. There was Farrell at the top of the list, but also names that were on it were Tom Hardy and Michael Fassbender. However, it didn't take long after the rumours surfaced for Farrell to emerge as the top choice, and he was duly offered the role in November of 2010. By February 2011, the project was all official and it was definitely going ahead. It got to the point where Sony issued a press release announcing an August 2012 release date for the film. That press release also revealed that James Vanderbilt, who'd worked on an assortment of Sony films, Spider-Man movies included, had been doing some polishing work on the movie. And the line that Sony put out was Total Recall is a new contemporized reimagining of the science fiction saga. Make of that what you will. By this stage, even though Farrell had been cast, though, it became clear that there were two major female lead roles that also needed filling, and there was an awful lot of speculation as to who would be taking those roles on. These varied slightly from the way they were depicted in the 1990 movie, but the next person to actually board the film was Bryan Cranston, and at this point, I mean, he was the star of Breaking Bad, but Breaking Bad was, as it was during most of its run, teetering on the edge of cancellation, and they weren't quite sure if it was going ahead, but he was announced as coming on board in the villain role, and at this point it was also reported that those two female lead roles, Laurie and Melinda, well, the shortlist for those was Kate Bosworth, Diane Kruger, Eva Mendes, Paula Patton, Jessica Biel, Eva Green, and they were all said to be reading for both parts. There was also a story going around at the time that Scarlett Johansson was offered the role of Melina, but she was at that point committed to making the Avengers movie, so couldn't do it. Michael Ironside around this time was said to have been offered a cameo in the new Total Recall, but he turned that down. Jessica Biel firmly came into the reckoning in April 2011, as she was then marked as one of the favourites for the film. But already by this stage, it was with each casting rumour, it seemed a bit more of the plot was eking out as well. So it was clear that the new film wasn't going to be heading to Mars as the first movie had, and was again looking to go close to the original story and make it Earth-based. Kate Beckinsale, in April 2011, she was said to have been offered a lead role at that stage, and she obviously worked with Wiseman on Underworld. The pair are married as well. Within a few weeks, Beckinsale signed on the dotted line to play Laurie Quaid in the role that was expanded from the first movie, and then Jessica Biel, she was confirmed in the role of Rachel. The rest of the cast was also fleshed out. Bill Nighy joined at that point in the role of Quarto. John Cho wouldn't be far behind in joining the ensemble either. And then there was Bokeem Woodbine. He came in the role of Harry. Now, a lot of the conversation was always, and a lot of the speculation around the film was how close it would be to the original film. Wiseman was very aware of this, and also he wanted to pay tribute to it as well. And as he was preparing the movie, he made a list of some of the moments that he remembered from the first movie as a roadmap for some of the iconic moments he wanted to put into his film as well. As filming came closer and it would start shooting in the spring of 2011, there was a slight potential problem over scheduling that nearly lost two members of cast. That Kate Beckinsale was in line for, had been cast in the role of Laurie, but she was also committed to making the new Underworld movie that Wiseman was also overseeing but not directing. As it turned out, there was a slight delay to filming on Total Recall that made, and as a consequence, she was available to take the lead, take one of the lead roles in that movie. Likewise, Colin Farrell had a clash as well. He'd been linked and offered Cosmopolis with David Cronenberg. Don't all these stories knit together? In Farrell's case, he did have to drop out the Cronenberg movie. He would be replaced by Robert Pattinson in that one. Meanwhile, Wiseman was working with production designer Patrick Tatopoulos, and they were. He told my former colleague Ryan Lambie over at Den of Geek back when we were there that my production designer and I, we went to great lengths to bring the design of The Fall, which is the heart of the mechanics of the film, to life. It's such a crazy hard thing to imagine in reality, and so designing that was a big challenge because I wanted the world to feel as realistic as possible. A future world is supposed to be fantastic in its presentation, but I wanted it to feel connected to our reality. There were clearly lots of challenges here. The filming would begin in the spring of 2011, as I said, in May of 2011. It took place in Toronto, and it was, again, it was not going to be cheap. This one's going to cost $125 million to make. The shoot would wrap up in September of 2011, so it wasn't quite as long as the original, but also it could lean more on CG as well, even though Wiseman was keen that it was as practical as it could be. I mean, Wiseman's background was working as an illustrator at first, then he worked in props departments, and he would say this was a massive build. Our stages were enormous. Part of the reason, he explained, we landed in Toronto was because they had the most stage space available, really really great stages. There were some of the biggest sets, certainly that I've ever shot as a director, but also as a crew member. And what they did is they designed the set with a view that they could shoot it from as many angles as possible, which might sound common sense, but they were making a big science fiction movie here. And the kind of ethos was it is, how can we make one set kind of feel like 3 or 4? A good set, Wiseman reasoned, was cheaper than ordering a new special effect. If you could just place the camera somewhere else and point it at something practical, you weren't going to have to brief the effects team and stump up another $1 million or $2 million just to get some computer jiggery to get you out of a corner. Now, there was some playing on set as well. Wiseman did an interview with Cinema Blend where he talked about Bryan Cranston's performance in the movie. And this is quite interesting because Cranston's villain, I'm going to spoil light as possible, doesn't appear on screen until very late in. And this goes to, it seems, the way that the part was shot and the options that it gave Wiseman, because he encouraged Cranston to play the role of Cahagan in a few different ways. And the idea was that he would sort out quite which way to go in post-production, which it's easy for me on the outside looking in to say that sounds a bit odd, but then I'd imagine there's lots of instances in filmmaking where that's been tried and it's worked. The consequence, though, in this case, was the film's pretty much nearly done by the time that Cranston appears. But nonetheless, the film shooting went on. The film was wrapped up. We were into post-production, and then basically the need to combat the negativity that was circling just the sheer existence of this project. So promotion for the film began in earnest, and it was heading towards an August release. Whilst the extensive post-production work was going on, and that post-production work would also involve changing location names a little bit to make them a little less sensitive, the first trailer for the film came in March 2012. Now, this was the era where you had to have a teaser for the teaser for the teaser trailer, and that caused a little bit of irritation as well. I think the movie websites at the time, I was doing one at the time, were pretty unimpressed just at the fact the film was happening, and so didn't need that many excuses just to fire a dart in its direction. But Wiseman got quite involved here. I thought this was quite interesting because whilst it's pretty much more commonplace now, he released a version of the ultimate trailer, which was released in full in April of 2012, with a commentary track on it and talked people through it. He was really keen to get across the differences of his film, the fact that he wasn't trying to trample over a film that people really have a lot of affection for, and that he had a story to tell here. And he kept working through the edit, and he got the final cut of his film down to, the first final cut of the film down to 2 hours, 20 minutes. And what he did is he pulled in some filmmaking friends, Simon Field, Alex Kurtzman, and screened it for them. Obviously, the studio came in and took a look at it. And all this helped shape the movie down to the sub 2 hour cut that we ultimately got when it was released in cinemas. However, it was also against this backdrop that the PG-13 bomb was dropped, that there'd been suspicions that this particular film would come out with a PG-13 rating, and whilst Verhoeven had to curtail his film to get an R, he still went with most of the incredibly violent stuff that he shot rather than the softer versions that Ronald Schwarzenegger and Arnold Schwarzenegger were pushing him towards. In the case of Len Wiseman's Total Recall, it was going to be PG-13, and his argument was, if you read the short story, it's not an R-rated story. It's just people's memory was clearly hugely influenced by the film that had come before, and it didn't help, I'd suggest, that the 2012 movie then chose to reference the 1990 movie on several occasions. There's the one moment where the lady who has enhanced mammary quantity, let's go with that, appears, and it's just like, it's such an obvious cutback to the original film, just like surely you're kind of you're setting yourself up for a fall by even invoking it. And it's a shame, really, because there are, I think, quite a few ideas in the new Total Recall that were overlooked as a consequence. I think the world building in it's actually strong. I'm not massively fond of it. I think by the second half of it, it just kind of goes down a trail of CG blah a little bit. But I do think that there's some kind of pulse in the opening of the film. So certainly the first 30-40 minutes of it. But now in people's eyes, there was a remake of Total Recall, and it was going to be PG-13, and at they just weren't happy about that at all. And it kind of took Wiseman a bit by surprise, this. I mean, he gave an interview to MovieWeb when he was promoting the film, and he talked about how people were hung up on the original version. And as he said, he was talking to people and they're saying, we like it, we really love it, but where was Arnold? They can't get over this Arnold Schwarzenegger thing. And he says, I was surprised by that. It was very eye-opening to go overseas to promote the film. They don't talk about Arnold in the way that we do here in America. They were able to see the film more as a sci-fi film and as a movie rather than it being compared to Arnold. And his point clearly is that the American audience in particular was quite Schwarzenegger driven. And he says, I think that shocked me and Colin Farrell himself. We talk so much about Quaid and how that Quaid character was in the Philip K. Dick story, not about how Arnold was portraying him, but how Quaid was. And when you get the movie out there, so much of it becomes about Colin Farrell and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it was something that the film couldn't shake. By the time it came to release and it was shown to reviewers, I mean, bluntly, it just hadn't shaken that at all. The critical response to it was really quite poor. That there was praise for some of its visuals, and in fact that first hour was where most people found the positives in the movie, but that it never really fully gave its reason for existing. If anything, it too wasn't as close to the Philip K. Dick story as perhaps fans of that original would have wanted it to be. Now, Wiseman, actually, to be fair to him, was very aware of that. He'd put together a different director's cut of the movie originally, and in the aftermath of the theatrical release of the movie, he would get a chance to come to that. But let's just quickly deal with that release. The film came out on August the 4th, 2012 in the US, and it opened to, it opened to solid business, really. An opening weekend of $25 million was not shabby. Although The Dark Knight Rises was still top of the box office after a couple of weeks at that point. The other big opener that weekend was Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Dog Days. I quite like the Diary of a Wimpy Kid films. The ones that were hanging around, Ice Age Continental Drift was still going. The Watch, Step Up Revolution, Ted, The Amazing Spider-Man, Brave, Magic Mike, Moonrise Kingdom were rounding out the top 10. The problem for Total Recall, though, was its business collapsed fast. That it dropped by, nearly 70% in its second week. By the time it was going up to its third week, it was just about still in the top 10. Its US gross in the end, and remember this was a $125 million film to make, was just shy of 60 million. It wasn't shabby performance. It did 140 million outside of the US for a worldwide gross that came in at $198.5 million. So not an outright flop, but certainly far below where Sony would have wanted it to be. There had, after all, been talk and some degree of confidence to the point where they were fairly open about the fact that if this did well, they were looking to do a Total Recall 2 to follow it on, but it just didn't do well enough to do that. But going back to the disc release of the film, because this was still an era where a film could make up some of its money by a quality home formats release, and Sony, as it had done with Salt, allowed Len Wiseman to construct and finish a second cut of the film. Now, in the case of Salt, there are 3 different versions of that movie on the disc, another Sony release. In the case of Total Recall, Wiseman put together his director's cut, and again, going back to an interview he did with MovieWeb, he said the themes and the questions that come out of Dick's short story we expanded on. Unfortunately, that didn't make the theatrical cut. That's a demon I battled with. And he said, I wanted to present something that was very new, but you get some kickback from that as well. With a remake, that's difficult. You want to make it different enough to where hopefully people like myself want to see something that is different, but if it's too different, people get upset. And I think he's hinting there at some kind of studio pushing back on the film that he was ultimately looking to make. But Sony gave him the funds to put together a director's cut of the movie that ran close to 2 hours 20 minutes, and it was mainly story that was put back in. But also put back in was Ethan Hawke. Now, it had been reported while the movie was shooting that he had a cameo in the new Total Recall, and he did. I mean, he duly went and shot it, and the story, as reported while the film was shooting, was he had a 5-page monologue scene in the movie, and he was going to play a version of Quaid before Quaid's memory was erased. He reappears in the director's cut, along with a fair amount of added story bits and bobs, and it was a little bit better received than the theatrical version of the movie. But the problem still was that there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for this new Total Recall. Here's a few words actually from Michael Ironside contrasting the two films.
If you don't have story and deft storytelling, you don't have a good product. And I don't mean to shit on anything, but Total Recall that was out a couple of years ago, based on what Paul did, is a good example. You have all the technology and the bells and whistles in the world with that new release of Total Recall, and based against what we did in Mexico, what Paul did in Mexico, and there's no comparison, because the original has story in it. It has story. It has a compelling relationship between the characters. You care for certain people in it. You root for some. You hiss for others. It really comes down to the quality of storytelling.
And with that, I do thank Michael Ironside for taking my call and answering the questions. I'm not quite as down on the new Total Recall as he is, but I do see his points. Wiseman, in the aftermath of this one, well, he was linked with the infamous remake of The Mummy that his friend Alex Kurtzman would go on and do, starring Tom Cruise. But interestingly, he's gone back to television, really, since that film was released. He's trying to get a new Die Hard movie off the ground. McClane, that was announced. But he's been working on TV shows as diverse as Sleepy Hollow, Swamp Thing, and Lucifer. And yet, to this point, Total Recall is his last, at the point this has been recorded, theatrical release. It's a little harsh. I'm quite a fan of his Die Hard sequel. I've taken some battering for that over time. But what was clear is the idea to go back to Total Recall didn't quite work out in the way that Sony wanted. The RoboCop film that would follow a couple of years later was slightly more successful. But in the midst of in the aftermath of both of those, plans to bring Starship Troopers back, well, they were quietly retired. And that all brings me to the end of what's been a very long episode of Film Stories. Thank you for bearing with me. Even more of my waffling, imagine that, on Twitter at Simon Brew. More from the Film Stories Project at Film Stories Pod. You can find our website, filmstories.co.uk, where it's updated every weekday with movie features. We've got hundreds of those now. Movie news stories as well. And we do try and make that a clickbait-free website and just try and do something a little bit different with it. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, meanwhile, you can find our print magazines, 20 issues and counting of Film Stories, 5 issues and counting of Film Stories Junior at the point this is being recorded. We're offering gift subscriptions for Christmas for those magazines. If you can help spread the words of that, I'd hugely appreciate that. You can find more of us on YouTube as well, with some video exclusive stuff at youtube.com/filmstories, and we hide away on Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. But I have waffled too much, and as always, the most important thing is that you're all well and you all stay safe. Please do look after yourselves, and I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, thanks for listening, take care, and bye-bye.